The town of Milhaven, Tennessee, sits at the end of a two-lane road that most maps don't bother naming. Farmland stretches out in every direction, flat, colorless, broken only by tree lines that darken early and stay dark long after sunrise. It was never a town that grew. It simply persisted, the way certain things persist. Not out of strength, but out of stubbornness or something older than stubbornness. The kind of place where what happens tends to stay, where the ground holds things longer than it should. For 3 weeks before Daniel Marsh returned, people had been vanishing from Milh Haven, one every few nights, without pattern or warning. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, only the absence left behind, and on the ground where each person was last seen, a black scorch mark, burned deep into the earth, roughly the shape of a human body lying flat. The sheriff had filed reports. State investigators had driven down, walked the fields, asked the same questions in different orders, and left without answers. The people of Milh Haven had drawn their curtains and stopped going out after dark, and the town had taken on the quality of something holding its breath. Daniel had not been back to Milh Haven in 15 years. He had left at 19 and made a life for himself in Nashville, modest, unremarkable, and exactly what he'd wanted. Distance from the town. Distance from the land his family had owned for generations. Distance from whatever it was about Milh Haven that had always made him uneasy in a way he couldn't articulate, even as a child. His father's death ended that distance. Not the grief, which was complicated and quiet and would take time to understand, but the practical matter of inheritance, the deed transfer, the property documentation, the legal formality of passing land from one generation to the next. He drove down on a Tuesday evening, intending to be gone by Thursday. He arrived at dusk. The road in from the highway felt narrower than he remembered, the surrounding fields grayer and more compressed, as though the land itself had shifted slightly in his absence and hadn't bothered to shift back. By the time he reached the main street, the last light had left the sky. The town was empty. Not in the ordinary way of a small town after business hours, emptied in a way that felt deliberate, enforced. Every storefront dark, every porch abandoned. The few faces he glimpsed behind curtained windows did not linger. They withdrew the moment they registered that someone was looking back. His father's house was unlocked, cold, and smelled of dust and old timber and something faintly acrid underneath, the ghost of something burned, carried on still air. Daniel set his bag in the front room and stood for a moment in the silence of a house where no one lived anymore. His childhood neighbor appeared at the door before he had turned on a light. She was a woman he had known his entire life, and she had aged in a way that went beyond the ordinary arithmetic of years, not older so much as lessened, as though something had been steadily drawn out of her over a long period of time, and she had simply continued on without it. She stood in the doorway and told him what she knew about the disappearances, speaking quietly and without drama, the way people speak when they have moved past shock into something more permanent. She described the scorch marks. She described the silence that had settled over the town. She did not tell him to leave, perhaps because she already understood in some way she couldn't name that leaving was no longer the point. She left. Daniel locked the door behind her and stood alone in the dark of his dead father's house. He did not sleep that first night, not truly. The house produced sounds that bore no resemblance to the ordinary complaints of old timber. Sounds with intention, with direction, with a quality that suggested awareness. Footsteps moved down the hallway and stopped outside his bedroom door at precise, measured intervals. A low resonance moved through the walls, too faint to be called a voice, but too structured to be wind. At some point in the deepest part of the night, his own name passed through the room without any visible source, not loud, not theatrical, but spoken with the confidence of something that had known exactly where he was all along. He lay still in the dark and did not respond. Morning came eventually, the way it always does, reluctantly and without much light. He spent the morning at the county clerk's office working through the property paperwork. The clerk processed his documents without incident until she encountered his surname on the deed transfer. Something shifted in her then. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be easily named. She simply paused, and when she looked up at him, her expression carried a weight that the moment didn't seem to call for. She told him to look into the history of the South parcel before he finalized anything. She offered nothing more than that, turned away, and returned to her work. He spent the afternoon asking questions and was directed eventually to Elijah Cole, 83 years old, a retired minister who had lived in Milh Haven without interruption since his birth. Elijah sat at the corner diner and listened to everything Daniel told him with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time for this particular conversation. What Elijah knew was this: Daniel's grandfather had demolished a chapel on the south parcel in the early 1940s. Not abandoned or converted, demolished entirely, the stone stripped and repurposed for another structure. The chapel had stood on that land for nearly a century, built by the town's founders over a site they had marked as significant, sacred to some accounts, dangerous to others. Something had been interred beneath that site long before the town existed. The chapel, in its way, had functioned as a seal over it. When the chapel came down, whatever had been sealed beneath it was no longer sealed. The disappearances, Elijah explained, were not new to Milh Haven. They went back to the mid-1940s, arriving in cycles, dormant for years, then active again, then dormant. And each cycle, without a single exception in 4 decades of recorded history, had begun within days of a member of the Marsh family returning to town. Daniel sat with that for a long time. That night, he drove to the south parcel alone. The land was flat and dead in the way of a place that had been dead for a long time. Not seasonal dormancy, but something more final, as though the ground itself had given up producing. The granite foundation sat at the center of the property, partially sunk into the earth, dark with weather and age. Around it, scattered at irregular intervals, the ground was scorched black and bare. The marks were visible even in the dark. There were more of them than he had expected. He stood at the edge of the foundation with his flashlight and let the light move across the stone. He was trying to feel something conclusive, grief or certainty, or the particular kind of fear that clarifies rather than paralyzes. What he felt instead was the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something that had been watching him since long before he arrived. He heard movement behind him. He turned. His neighbor was standing 20 feet away in the darkness, and the wrongness of her presence registered before any conscious thought could form around it. She was standing too precisely, too still, in the way of something that has adopted a shape rather than grown into one. Her eyes, caught at the edge of the flashlight beam, held no recognition, no warmth, no trace of the woman he had known since childhood. What was behind them was patient and very old, and had been waiting far longer than anyone in Milh Haven had been alive. She took one step toward him. The flashlight went out. By morning, Daniel's car sat empty on the south parcel. Elijah found the scorch mark before anyone else did. It was still faintly warm when he pressed his hand flat against the earth. He stayed there for a moment with his palm on the ground, feeling the warmth fade, and then he stood and walked back to his car without looking at the foundation. The sheriff filed a missing persons report. Investigators came again and found nothing actionable. Daniel Marsh was added to the file cabinet of identical cases, and the investigation eventually went the way all the previous investigations had gone. The real Carol Hensley was found at home, unharmed, with no memory of the previous night. The disappearances stopped. The scorch marks stopped appearing. The town of Milh Haven exhaled slowly over the course of weeks, and the people began going outside after dark again and stopped checking the ground each morning for new burn marks. They told themselves it was finished. They allowed themselves to believe that whatever cycle had been running had finally completed itself, and that the south parcel would go quiet and stay quiet. Elijah did not correct them. He understood that belief, even incomplete belief, is something people need to continue. And he was not in the business of taking things from people that they need. He returned to the south parcel once, in November, alone. He stood at the edge of the stone foundation in the thin, cold afternoon light and looked at the ground where the scorch marks had been. They were gone, faded entirely back into the earth, as though they had never existed. And at the center of the foundation, in the patch of ground that had been dead and pale for as long as anyone in Milh Haven could remember, the grass was growing back, green, new, undisturbed.
Elijah stood there for a long time, long enough for the afternoon to begin its collapse into evening, long enough for the temperature to drop and the tree lines at the edge of the property to go dark. Then he walked back to his car and drove home before the last of the light was gone, and he locked his doors, and he did not return to that land again. The south parcel was sold at auction the following spring. The buyer was a developer from out of state who had no knowledge of the property's history and no particular reason to ask about it. He broke ground in June. His crew abandoned the project in July. The developer sold the land at a significant loss before autumn. The stone foundation was not touched. It remains there now, settled further into the earth each year, returning slowly to the ground that produced it. The grass around it grows normally. The grass at its center grows faster than it should, and greener, as though something beneath it is feeding it from below. No one in Millhaven goes near that land after dark. No one talks about why.
The night shift at Harrogate Psychiatric Center always started the same way. A walk down the east corridor, a clipboard check, a quiet prayer that nothing would happen before sunrise. Nurse Ellie Marsh had done this walk 100 times at other facilities. Harrogate was supposed to be no different. A new job in a new town. Clean slate. Simple enough, but that was before room 14. It was 11:47 p.m. when Ellie first paused outside that door. She wasn't sure what stopped her. Maybe a sound, barely audible through the thick steel frame, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails dragging slowly against drywall. She told herself it was nothing, told herself she was tired. Then she pressed her ear to the door and listened. It wasn't scratching, it was whispering. A woman's voice, low and monotone, repeating the same phrase over and over. So many times the words had lost all meaning and become something else entirely. Something that raised the hair on Ellie's forearms and made her take one long step back from the door without fully knowing why. She kept walking. She finished her rounds. She told herself she'd ask about room 14 in the morning. She didn't wait that long. By 1 a.m., she was at the nurse's station asking her senior colleague, a woman named Scaryn, who'd worked at Harrogate for 11 years, about the patient behind that door. Scaryn set down her coffee. She didn't look surprised by the question. She looked like she had been expecting it. The patient's name was Mara Voss. She was 29 years old. She had been admitted 8 months ago, brought in by her mother, who still called every single night at 11 p.m. without fail. Always the same questions, always the same desperate hope in her voice that something had changed. Nothing ever had. Before Harrogate, Mara had been a graduate student. Brilliant by every account. The kind of person who lit up rooms, who collected friends the way some people collect books. Naturally, effortlessly, with genuine warmth. She had a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like the life she had planned. But Mara had always lived most deeply inside her own head. She kept journals, dozens of them stacked in her apartment. Not ordinary journals, elaborate ones filled with the kind of writing that wasn't quite fiction and wasn't quite reality. She wrote about the person she was going to love someday. She described him in extraordinary detail, the way he'd carry himself, the texture of his voice, the specific shade of dark that his eyes would be in low light. She had mapped out every corner of a relationship that hadn't happened yet with the certainty of someone recounting a memory. Her friends found it romantic at first, then quietly strange, then worrying, because the descriptions never changed. Not over months, not over years. The man in Mara's journals stayed exactly the same, while everyone around her grew and shifted and moved on. He was the fixed point she organized her entire life around. And then she met Daniel Holt. She met him at a university mixer in October. He was leaning against a wall near the back of the room, wearing a dark jacket, holding a glass he hadn't touched. Something about the angle of him, the stillness, stopped Mara cold in the middle of a conversation she immediately forgot. She would later tell a friend that it was like walking into a room and finding a photograph of someone you'd been dreaming about for years. Because he matched. Not vaguely, not close enough. He matched the way a key matches a lock it was made for. She introduced herself. He smiled, and something in Mara Voss quietly, completely broke open. What followed looked like love. From the inside, it probably felt like it too. Daniel was attentive and intense and magnetic in ways that made Mara feel seen in a way she'd never quite experienced before. But there were signs early on that something beneath the surface of him wasn't right. Small things. The way he'd go very still when she mentioned other people. The way conversations would turn, subtly but reliably, back toward her. What she wore, what she ate, how she spent every hour he wasn't with her. The way he once drove 40 minutes to her apartment because she hadn't responded to a text in 3 hours. Mara noticed these things, and she explained them away one by one, the way people in love have always explained inconvenient truths away. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Daniel had done all of this before. The first time she saw the box, she wasn't supposed to be at his apartment. She'd come to leave a birthday card before he got home from class. He'd given her a key weeks earlier in a gesture she'd found deeply romantic. She let herself in, set the card on the counter, and almost left. Almost. The box was on the top shelf of his closet, half hidden behind a row of hanging shirts. She would not have noticed it at all if the closet door hadn't swung open on its own. An old building, a draft, the kind of coincidence that doesn't feel like coincidence until much later. It was a shoebox, ordinary in every way except for what was inside it. Photographs, not of landscapes or events or candid moments at parties, photographs of women, each one beautiful, each one captured in the kind of unguarded moment that made it clear they hadn't known the picture was being taken. There were dozens of them, rubber-banded into small stacks, and tucked behind the stacks, a set of cards, index cards, handwritten, each one bearing a name, a description, and a single date. The dates were all in the past. None of them were recent. Mara put the box back exactly the way she'd found it. She walked out of the apartment and sat in her car in the parking lot for a long time. The birthday card was still on his counter. She wanted to believe there was an explanation. She turned over everything she knew about Daniel and looked for the version of the story where the box made sense, where it was harmless, where she was overreacting, where the women in those photographs were old friends, a creative project, something innocent she was too paranoid to see. She called his number. He answered on the second ring. His voice was exactly the same as it always was. Warm, easy, like nothing in the world was wrong. She told him she'd stopped by. She told him she'd left a card. She did not mention the box. He said he couldn't wait to see her and asked what she was doing for dinner. She said she wasn't sure. She said she'd let him know. She hung up and sat in that parking lot until the sun went down. She stopped returning his messages the next day. What happened in the weeks that followed was the kind of thing Mara couldn't adequately describe to the police when she finally went to them. Not because she didn't remember, but because the details, laid out plainly, sounded too strange to land with the weight they deserved. He started leaving things at her apartment. Not threatening things. Flowers, a book she'd mentioned once in passing, a handwritten letter that was so perfectly measured in its affection that it made her skin crawl in a way she couldn't explain. Then, the things changed. A dead bird on her windowsill, her name written on her car windshield in something dark red that she refused to have tested. A voicemail that was nothing but silence for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The police took a report. They told her to call if anything escalated. 3 weeks later, Daniel Holt was found at the base of the fire escape behind Mara's apartment building. The medical examiner ruled it an accident. Mara wasn't so sure, and somewhere deep down, in the part of herself she didn't like to examine directly, she wasn't entirely sure it mattered. That was when the dreams started. Not nightmares exactly, more like visitations. He would be standing in some corner of the room she was in, wearing that dark jacket, holding that untouched drink, smiling the way he'd smiled the first night she met him. Sometimes he spoke, most of the time he just watched. And every single time she woke up, it was 1 a.m. exactly. Not 12:58, not 1:03, always exactly 1. She stopped sleeping, started hearing things in empty rooms, stopped trusting the edges of her vision, which kept catching shapes that disappeared when she turned to look at them. By the time her mother brought her to Harrogate, Mara hadn't spoken a full sentence to another person in 3 weeks. She sat in the back seat for the entire drive without moving, staring at something in the space just past the windshield, something her mother couldn't see. Karen told Ellie all of this slowly, in the hush of the empty nurses' station, with the fluorescent light above them buzzing faintly and the rest of the building wrapped in its particular deep night quiet. Then Karen said one more thing. She said that the whispering, the thing Ellie had heard through the door of room 14, had started 3 months ago, always at the same time, always in the same tone, that the staff had recorded it once just to have on file, that when they played it back and managed to isolate the words through the audio, it wasn't a phrase, it was a name, the same name, repeated over and over, the name of a man who had been dead for 8 months. Ellie set down her clipboard. The fluorescent light above them buzzed once, sharply, and went out. In the dark, from somewhere down the east corridor, came the sound of a door swinging slowly open. And then, the whispering started again. Some people believe that obsession is a kind of gravity, that it bends the space between people even after one of them is gone. The scientists would call that impossible. But scientists have never worked the night shift at Harrogate. Scientists have never heard what Ellie Marsh heard next, walking back toward room 14 with a flashlight in one hand and every rational explanation she'd ever trusted quietly failing her. She never did tell anyone what she found inside that room. She quit the next morning, left her badge on the desk, didn't answer when her supervisor called. Mara Voss is still a patient at Harrogate Psychiatric Center. Her mother still calls every night at 11 p.m. Room 14 still has a waiting list. There are certain memories that don't fade the way memories are supposed to. Most things blur with time. Faces soften, dates dissolve. The sharp edges of old moments round themselves down into something you can live alongside without flinching. But then there are the other ones. The ones that stay in focus no matter how many years pile up between you and them. The ones that, if you let your mind drift toward them even for a second, come back in full detail. Color, sound, temperature, smell. Like a film playing on a screen you can't look away from. What happened to me the summer I was 12 years old is one of those memories. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew which family owned which fields and where the county road flooded every spring without fail. We were surrounded by farmland on 3 sides and the Hollow Creek on the 4th, a wide, muddy river that ran faster than it looked and had a reputation among the older people in town that the younger ones were always too confident to take seriously. My best friend, since before I can remember, was a boy named Curtis. We had spent every summer of our lives doing the things that boys in small towns do when no one is watching them closely enough. Fishing in water we weren't supposed to fish in, climbing things we weren't supposed to climb, wandering further from home than anyone knew. That summer felt like all the others. It didn't announce itself as different, it just was. It was late July when the funeral happened. 2 men from our town died within 4 days of each other. The first, struck by lightning while working his backfield during an afternoon storm that had come up faster than the weather service predicted, and the second from a heart attack that his family said the shock of the first death had brought on. They were neighbors, had been friends for 40 years. The town took both losses the way small towns do, quietly, completely, with the kind of collective grief that doesn't need to explain itself because everyone already understands. Curtis and I had known them both. His father's side of the family had farmed beside them for 2 generations. We had been in and out of their barns our whole lives, had eaten at their tables during harvest dinners, had been shooed off their property 100 times with the particular affection that older farmers reserve for children they've half adopted by proximity. We went to both funerals. We stood in the church and then at the graveside in the clothes our mothers had pressed in the July heat, watching adults cry in the open air in that restrained Midwestern way. Tight jaws, eyes that went somewhere else, hands folded too carefully in front of them. After the second burial, most of the town went down to the creek. This was something they did. I didn't know the origin of it, whether it was old tradition or habit or something that had simply started happening long enough ago that no one questioned it anymore. After a burial, people went to the water. They washed their hands and sometimes their faces and stood there quietly for a few minutes before heading home. I had seen it happen before, but never paid much attention to the reason. That afternoon, the adults gathered near the bank where the water was wide and calm and shallow enough to stand in without any concern. They talked in low voices. This is the part I have tried to explain a dozen times over the years, and I'm still not sure I have the right words for it. I waded in with everyone else, and then, because I was 12 and reckless and a strong swimmer and the current looked manageable, I kept going. I moved past the shallow bank and into the deeper middle channel, where the water went dark and cold, and the sound of the voices on the shore became a murmur. I wasn't frightened. I was showing off for no one in particular, the way boys do when the only audience is themselves. I had made it maybe 30 feet from shore when something grabbed my ankle. Not caught, not snagged on something beneath the surface. Grabbed. The distinction felt absolutely clear in the moment and has remained clear in my memory ever since. There was a grip, deliberate, firm, coming from directly below me, and then a pull, downward, strong enough that my whole body went under before I could fill my lungs. I came back up thrashing. I screamed something, I don't know what, some version of help, and went under again. The current was faster in the deep channel than it had looked from shore. I couldn't find the bottom. Whatever had hold of me hadn't let go. I remember the surface of the water above me, green-lit and fractured, and then I remember nothing. When I came back to myself, I was on the bank. Curtis was kneeling beside me. His father was there. A handful of other men from town were standing in a loose circle, looking down at me with the particular expression that adults have when they've just been genuinely frightened and are converting it as fast as they can into something that looks like calm. I had been pulled out by a man named Raymond Tuttle, one of the older farmers, a man in his late 60s who had known the two men who died better than almost anyone else in town. He'd waded in without hesitation when he heard me go under. Curtis told me later that Raymond had already been moving before anyone else even registered what was happening, as if he'd been watching me from the moment I left the bank. Raymond didn't make much of it. He didn't seem like a man who'd done something remarkable. He seemed like a man who'd done something obvious. What I couldn't explain then, and still can't, was what happened in the water before I lost consciousness. I heard something, not above the surface, not from shore, from below me, or from all around me in the particular non-directional way that sound moves underwater. A voice, low and calm, speaking in a tone that didn't belong to panic or to drowning, but to something else entirely. Something that felt, in the surreal, slowed-down logic of those few seconds, like a warning. Not a sentence, not words I could later reconstruct and write down and show you, but a voice, clearly, unmistakably. A voice that didn't belong to anyone in the water with me, because no one else was in the water with me. They checked. People looked. The men who pulled me out described the spot clearly. There had been no one in the deep channel when they reached me. Nothing beneath the surface, just cold, dark water and a 12-year-old boy going under. I told Curtis what I'd heard. He got quiet in the way he only got quiet when something genuinely unsettled him. He told his grandmother that night, and she wasn't surprised at all. She said what a lot of the older people in that town seemed to believe, that the creek had a long memory, that people who had lived and worked and died beside it for generations didn't entirely leave it when they went, that the land held something of them, and the water held something too, and that this wasn't frightening necessarily. It was simply the way things were in a place that had been home to the same families for long enough. I was a kid. I didn't know what to do with that. I'm an adult now. I've read enough and lived enough to know how the rational mind handles experiences like mine. The oxygen deprivation, the disorientation, the way extreme fear manufactures sensation and meaning in the gap between stimulus and processing. I know the explanations. I can walk through them. They are not unreasonable. But here is the thing about the rational explanation. It sits in my head like furniture I've arranged carefully and can describe in detail. And what happened in that water sits in my chest like something else entirely. Immediate and specific and 30 years old and still completely unchanged. Raymond Tuttle passed away the following winter, heart trouble. He was buried in the same cemetery as the two men who had died that July, not far from the graves that had brought us all to the creek that afternoon. I went back to Hollow Creek the summer after that, stood on the bank for a while, didn't go in. I'm not sure what I was expecting. Nothing happened. The water moved the way water moves. The afternoon light came through the trees in long lines, and the current made its constant, unremarkable sound, and everything was perfectly, entirely ordinary. I drove home and sat in my driveway for a long time before going inside. Some places accumulate something over time. The scientists would say that's projection, that we assign weight to geography because of what happened there, not because the place itself holds anything. They're probably right, but I keep thinking about Raymond Tuttle, already moving before anyone else looked up. I keep thinking about whatever had my ankle, and I keep thinking about the voice. If it was oxygen deprivation, it was very specific about what it wanted to say. I just wish I could remember exactly what that was.